The words didn't die in my throat. They just stayed there. Not because I forgot them, not because I didn't know what to say. I knew exactly what I wanted to say. I could feel it lined up behind my teeth like something living, pressing forward every time I inhaled, every time I opened my mouth just a little too wide, then stopping, hard, as if an invisible hand had gripped my jaw and held it shut. There are silences that happen by accident, a missed chance, a conversation that moves too fast, a moment where the room changes before you can catch up. This wasn't that. This was a silence I built, piece by piece. With each second I decided to wait. Each time I told myself, not yet. Not like this. Not in front of them. Not until I'm sure. Each time I convinced myself it would be cleaner to stay still, to let the air remain undisturbed. It didn't feel like cowardice at first. It felt like control. I remember the pressure behind my eyes, like holding back a cough in a place where noise is forbidden. I remember the way my hands stayed busy, always busy, because still hands invite questions. I remember swallowing too often, trying to push the words downward like they were food that hadn't been chewed enough. But words don't go down that way. They sit. They wait. And the longer they wait, the heavier they become, until it stops feeling like you're choosing silence and starts feeling like you're carrying something illegal inside your own body. I could hear other voices around me. Steady, confident, casual even. Voices that belonged in rooms where decisions were made. Voices that didn't hesitate because they didn't need to. They spoke as if speech itself was proof of being right. As if certainty was something you could manufacture simply by saying things out loud. And I watched myself become smaller with every sentence they finished. I would look at someone's mouth while they spoke, and feel my own mouth tighten, as if it could learn obedience by imitation. I would nod at the right moments because nodding was safe. It was expected. It cost nothing. It asked nothing of anyone. Sometimes my tongue would move before I stopped it. Just a shift, just a preparation, like the body testing the possibility of rebellion. And then I'd feel it. That jolt of fear, sharp and immediate, like touching a wire you didn't know was live. The fear wasn't loud, it was practical, measured, it didn't scream. It explained. If you speak, you will be seen. If you are seen, you can be blamed. If you are blamed, you will be remembered for the wrong reason. I told myself I wasn't afraid of punishment. That wasn't the word I used. I told myself I was afraid of being misunderstood. Afraid of creating confusion, afraid of saying it wrong, of choosing the wrong moment, of phrasing it in a way that made me sound weak or dramatic or disloyal, as if the problem was my delivery, as if the truth needed to be wrapped correctly to deserve air. And in the spaces between sounds, the small gaps where a different voice could have entered, I felt something else. Responsibility, quiet but persistent, like a hand resting on my shoulder, not accusing. Just present. It didn't demand heroism. It didn't promise reward. It simply reminded me that I was there, that I had noticed what others had not, that noticing meant something, whether I admitted it or not. There were moments when I almost let the words out, a breath drawn too deep, a hand lifting slightly from a table or a strap or a pocket, a shift forward, as if my body was trying to step into the open without consulting me. And every time I stopped myself with the same lie, repeated until it felt like reason. Someone else will say it. Someone with the right authority. Someone whose voice belongs here. Because my voice felt like an intrusion, like a stain, like a sound that would make every head turn in the wrong way. It's strange how quickly you can learn to distrust your own instincts when you're surrounded by people who never hesitate. How fast you begin to believe that the safest thing you can do is doubt yourself. I kept waiting for clarity, for proof, for something I could hold up like a document and say, here, now you have to listen. But the truth I had wasn't a document. It was a feeling, a pattern, a wrongness I could sense in the way certain words were spoken too easily, in the way certain questions were not asked, in the way everyone seemed to agree without truly seeing what they were agreeing to. And still I held it inside. Still I pressed my lips together and let the moment pass like a train I chose not to board. Because once you speak, you can't unspeak. And I wasn't ready to be the one who broke the quiet. So I stayed still. I listened. I nodded. And the words that should have left me remained trapped, and I let them. By the time I understood what kind of place it was, I had already learned the rules without anyone ever teaching them to me. They weren't written down. No one recited them like doctrine. They lived in small gestures. Who spoke first, who waited, who kept their eyes lowered just long enough to show respect without appearing afraid. The rules lived in the pauses between sentences, in the way certain topics turned a room colder, in the way laughter could vanish the moment a particular pair of boots crossed the threshold. We were surrounded by noise every day, but speech, real speech, was rare. Most of what passed between men was functional. Numbers, times, distances, confirmations, the kind of words that could be spoken without leaving fingerprints. Anything beyond that, anything that sounded like an opinion, a warning, a doubt, had weight, and weight was dangerous. I wasn't important. That's the first thing to understand. I wasn't one of the men whose names were carried from tent to tent like gospel. I wasn't the one people waited for. I wasn't the one who could change anything with a gesture. I existed in that middle layer where you are close enough to hear what matters, but low enough to be punished for noticing. Close enough to see the faces when they thought no one was watching. Close enough to hear the slight hesitations in orders that were supposed to sound clean. Close enough to watch decisions take shape not from certainty, but from momentum. The place ran on momentum. It ran on routine. Every morning had the same beginning. The smell that clung to fabric, the metallic taste that settled in your mouth when you hadn't slept enough, the small rituals performed like superstition. Men checking their equipment, rubbing their hands, counting and recounting as if repetition could keep misfortune away. Coffee boiled too long, bread torn rather than sliced, the scrape of chairs, the muted clearing of throats. And above it all, always above it all, was the structure. A chain you could not see but could feel. It showed itself in the way everyone straightened when certain voices approached. In the way conversations became shorter, safer. The way someone would glance at another man before finishing a thought, as if permission had to be silently granted. It wasn't only fear of punishment. It was fear of being marked. Marked as someone who thinks too much. Marked as someone who complicates things. Marked as someone who doesn't understand how the world works. There were men who could speak freely. You could tell who they were without knowing their titles. They carried themselves like the room belonged to them. Their silence was chosen, not forced. When they spoke, others made space for the sound. They could question without sounding insubordinate, could express doubt as if it were strategy, could disagree and still be considered loyal. Men like me couldn't afford that. For us, loyalty wasn't a virtue, it was a requirement. It was the price of being left alone. And being left alone was the closest thing to safety we had. The hierarchy didn't have to threaten you directly. It didn't need to. It trained you through example. We all knew stories, half-spoken, never confirmed. A man who asked the wrong question and was suddenly reassigned. A man who pushed too hard and found himself standing outside the circle forever. A man who was sent elsewhere and never seen again. The details were always vague. They had to be. Vague stories travel farther because no one can prove them false. And so we carried those stories like additional equipment, invisible but heavy. I watched how people survived. That was my education. There were the ones who stayed quiet and worked hard, who made themselves useful in ways no one could criticize. There were the ones who talked too much, who laughed too loudly, who tried to charm the wrong people and ended up fading from view. There were the ones who spoke only when spoken to, who kept their faces neutral even when their eyes said otherwise. And there were the ones who acted like certainty was a weapon. They delivered every sentence as if it were already approved. They never hesitated. They never looked down. They spoke in clean lines and expected the world to follow. Those men were valued, not because they were always right, but because they made things feel stable. Stability mattered more than truth. The environment demanded it. Everything around us was unstable. Weather, supplies, roads, rumors, the shifting line between safety and danger. So we created stability through obedience, through repetition, through the appearance of confidence. If an order sounded firm, it gave everyone something to hold on to. If a decision was stated without doubt, it made the uncertainty feel smaller. And if someone introduced hesitation into that structure, if someone raised a question that didn't have an immediate answer, it wasn't seen as caution. It was seen as erosion, a crack in the wall. I learned quickly that questions had a cost, even when they were asked politely, even when they were asked softly. Because the moment you ask, you are admitting something, that you do not fully trust what's been said, that you see a possible flaw, that you are thinking beyond your place in the chain, and thinking beyond your place could be interpreted as arrogance, or worse, disloyalty. Disloyalty was the word that hovered over everything, even when no one spoke it. It was a shape in the corner of the room, always present. It didn't need proof. It needed only suspicion. You didn't want suspicion, so you learned to say yes. You learned to say understood. You learned to repeat the words back exactly because repeating them proved you were not altering them. We passed messages down like stones, heavy, exact, unchanging. The ones above us threw them without hesitation. The ones below us caught them whether they wanted to or not. No one asked whether the stone should have been thrown in the first place. My position kept me near enough to hear discussions that weren't meant for everyone. Not secrets exactly. Just the kind of talk that happens when men believe the room is sealed. Maps spread flat, fingers tracing lines, voices kept low but confident. The language was always the same, objective, clipped, certain. But certainty can be performed. I began to recognize the performance, a tightness in a jaw, a pause before a word that was supposed to come easily, a hand that stayed on a map a little too long, as if the pressure of a palm could force reality to obey. Sometimes I noticed glances exchanged, quick, controlled, between men who were supposed to agree. Sometimes I noticed what wasn't said, and sometimes in those moments I felt something inside me respond. Not courage, not certainty, just awareness. The sense that something was being overlooked, that a piece didn't fit, that the calm confidence in the room was covering something softer underneath. But awareness is not power. Awareness can become a burden because you are left holding it alone. Around me, the daily routines kept flowing as if routine itself could prevent disaster. Men moved with purpose. Orders were written, repeated, confirmed. Words traveled in straight lines through the chain, gaining authority as they went, losing nuance, losing doubt. And every time I felt that pressure rise inside my chest, every time I felt my mind reaching for a question, I also felt the invisible weight of where I stood. Not at the top, not at the bottom, in the middle, where you could be blamed from above and crushed from below, where you are close enough to witness the machine turning, but not close enough to put your hands on the gears. It wasn't only fear that kept me quiet. It was the environment itself. This system built to keep things moving forward no matter what, built to treat hesitation like sabotage. Because in that world, stopping to question wasn't seen as saving lives. It was seen as slowing the march. So I did what I had been trained to do, even without anyone ever training me. I kept my face neutral. I kept my voice steady. I kept my thoughts to myself. And I watched the hierarchy press down on every impulse to speak, until even the idea of warning began to feel like a personal indulgence I had no right to afford. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from seeing something before it happens, and realizing that seeing it does not grant you the right to interfere. Once that awareness took hold, it followed me everywhere. It crept into moments that were supposed to be ordinary. It sat with me while I ate, while I cleaned, while I waited. It turned every quiet interval into a space where my mind replayed the same questions, over and over, without ever reaching an answer. What if I'm wrong? That was the first barrier, the most reasonable one, the one that sounded responsible, because doubt can always disguise itself as caution. I told myself that the feeling I had might be nothing more than nerves, that stress makes patterns where none exist, that fear sharpens imagination. I told myself that men with more experience, more authority, more distance from emotion had already considered everything I was noticing, and dismissed it for reasons I couldn't see. That explanation was comforting. It allowed me to remain still, but comfort didn't last. At night, when the noise finally died down and the air settled into something heavy and stale, The thoughts came back sharper, less polite. They didn't ask questions anymore. They made statements. This doesn't sit right. Something is being rushed. They're choosing certainty because uncertainty takes too long. I would lie there and imagine different versions of the same moment. In some, I spoke. In others, I hesitated just a second longer. In most, nothing changed, except me. In the versions where I spoke, the room would turn toward me. I could see it clearly. Faces pausing, expressions tightening. The brief, dangerous silence that follows an unexpected voice. Someone would ask me to repeat myself. Someone else would interrupt. Someone would remind me, calmly, firmly, of my position. I imagined the words I might use. I rehearsed them carefully, cutting away anything that sounded emotional, anything that could be dismissed as intuition or fear. I tried to shape them into something clean, something technical, something safe. But no matter how carefully I phrased them in my head, they still ended the same way, with me exposed. Exposed as the one who questioned, the one who slowed things down, the one who introduced doubt into a structure that depended on momentum. And then there were the other versions, the quieter ones, the ones where I stayed silent, like I had been trained to do. In those versions, nothing dramatic happened in the room. No heads turned, no voices hardened. Life continued smoothly, predictably. I remained invisible, unremarkable, safe, at least on the surface. But inside those versions, something corroded. I could feel it even before anything happened. This slow, grinding sensation, like carrying a small stone in your shoe and choosing not to remove it because stopping would be inconvenient. With every step, the irritation grew, but stopping still felt worse than enduring it. During the day, my thoughts split in two. One part of me stayed present, doing exactly what was expected, listening, repeating, moving when told to move, responding with the right tone, the right speed. That part of me functioned well. It drew no attention. The other part stood slightly apart, observing not just the situation but myself within it. "You're still here," it would say. "You're still choosing this." That second voice was quieter, but it was persistent. It didn't accuse, it didn't shame. It simply kept track. I began to notice how often I almost spoke. A breath held too long. A sentence forming before being swallowed. A word, if, rising to the edge of my mouth before being forced back down. Each time the same rationalizations arrived, practiced and efficient. "This isn't the right moment. You don't have all the facts. You'll sound unsure. You'll look like you're trying to protect yourself. They won't listen anyway." That last one was the most effective, because it turned silence into something that looked like wisdom. Why speak if no one would hear you? Why risk becoming a problem if the outcome would be the same? I told myself that staying quiet was not the same as agreeing, that inside, I remained separate, that my thoughts were intact, untouched by the decisions being made around me. That belief mattered. It allowed me to think of myself as uncorrupted. But there is a difference between thinking and acting, and the distance between them grows wider the longer you refuse to cross it. There were moments when the conflict became physical, my chest tightening for no clear reason, my jaw aching from being clenched too often, a faint tremor in my hands that I had to hide by keeping them busy. Fear has a way of finding the body, even when the mind insists it is under control. And beneath the fear, there was something else. Responsibility. Heavier now, more defined. Not responsibility for the decision. That wasn't mine. But responsibility for the knowledge. Once you see something, you can't pretend you haven't. Once you recognize a pattern, ignorance is no longer available to you. It's removed from the list of excuses. I knew that. That was the most dangerous part, because it meant that every time I chose silence, it was no longer passive. It was active, deliberate. I wasn't just failing to speak. I was deciding not to. I tried to balance it in my mind like an equation. If I speak and I'm wrong, I disrupt everything for nothing. If I speak and I'm right, I become the one who caused delay, confusion, resistance. If I stay silent and I'm wrong, no harm done. If I stay silent and I'm right, that was where the equation broke down, because the cost of being right while staying silent was too large to fully imagine. My mind would edge toward it, feel the weight, and then retreat. It was easier not to picture it, easier to believe that things would correct themselves, that someone else would notice, that events would bend away from disaster on their own. Hope can be a form of avoidance. I clung to it. I told myself that hesitation was humility, that obedience was professionalism, that restraint was maturity. I told myself many things, and with every hour that passed, the silence around my thoughts thickened, not as absence, but as pressure, like words compressing under their own weight, waiting, growing, becoming harder to release. By the time the moment approached, the one where my voice could have entered the room and altered the shape of what followed, I was already exhausted from arguing with myself. And exhaustion has a way of making silence feel inevitable. It whispers that you've already waited too long, that the moment has passed, that speaking now would only expose how late you are. So I stayed where I was, watching, listening, feeling the words press harder against the inside of my mouth, even as I prepared myself once again to let them remain there. The moment did not announce itself. There was no sudden hush, no dramatic shift in the air, no instinctive sense that this was it. It arrived the way most irreversible things do, quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as just another step in a process that had already been moving for too long to stop easily. I was there when it happened, close enough to hear the words clearly, close enough to understand their meaning, close enough to know, with a certainty that left no room for comfort, that this was the point where silence would stop being temporary. The room was not tense. That was the most unsettling part. Voices were steady, movements were efficient. Papers were adjusted, hands pointed, confirmations were given and repeated. The order, because that is what it was delivered without hesitation, shaped in language that left no space for alternatives. It sounded clean, final, reasonable. Around me, heads nodded, pens moved. Someone murmured acknowledgement. Someone else shifted their weight, already preparing for what came next. And inside me, something surged upward so suddenly it almost startled me into motion. This is wrong. The thought was not dramatic. It didn't come with panic or urgency. It came with clarity, a cold, sharp awareness that cut through every excuse I had been leaning on until then. Not maybe wrong, not possibly flawed. Wrong. I felt my body respond before my mind could interfere. My chest expanded as if to draw in the words. My throat tightened, then loosened. My tongue pressed against my teeth, already shaping the beginning of a sentence. I could feel the weight of every second stretching, thinning, becoming fragile. This was the opening. Narrow, but real. If I spoke now, it would not be interruption. It would be timing. I knew exactly what I would say. Not everything. Not a speech. Just enough. A single observation. A question framed carefully, stripped of emotion, designed to sound helpful rather than resistant. I remember thinking how simple it would be. And then I imagined the room turning. Not violently, not with anger. With attention. Attention is dangerous. I imagined the eyes on me, not curious but measuring. Calculating where I fit in the structure I had never been invited to question. I imagined the pause after my words, the silence that would follow, heavier than any response. I imagined someone asking me to explain myself. I imagined my explanation sounding smaller once it left my mouth, stripped of the certainty it had inside my head. I imagined someone else responding calmly, confidently, dismissing my concern with experience I could not claim. I imagined nods, not agreeing with me but with them. And then I imagined what would come after. Not punishment. That was too obvious, too dramatic. What I imagined was worse. Distance. A subtle shift in how I was seen. Conversations that ended when I entered a room. Decisions made without my presence. A sense that I had become unpredictable, unreliable, marked. All of this passed through me in the space of a breath. In that same breath, the words reached the threshold of my mouth and stopped. I felt it physically, the precise moment when intention collapsed into restraint. My jaw tightened. My tongue went still. The breath I had drawn escaped silently through my nose instead. No one noticed. The order continued to move through the room, gathering momentum as it was accepted, confirmed, passed along. Each repetition strengthened it, made it more real, more difficult to question. I stood there, perfectly still, my hands locked together so tightly my fingers ached. Inside, the words recoiled. They didn't disappear, they didn't fade. They folded inward, sharp and compressed, like metal forced into too small a space. I could feel them pressing against my chest, against my throat, as if my body itself were protesting the decision my mind had made. For a brief, irrational moment, I considered speaking anyway. Too late, awkwardly, after the fact. But that would have been worse. Late words sound like excuses. Late warnings sound like self-preservation. And I could not bear the thought of my silence transforming into something that looked like fear, exposed rather than fear-controlled. So I remained silent. I listened as the final confirmations were given. I watched as the discussion shifted seamlessly to implementation, as if no alternative had ever existed. I felt a strange detachment settle over me, like the numbness that follows a sharp pain, a sense that something essential had already been decided, not just in the room, but inside me. Because silence, once chosen in the presence of certainty, is not easily undone. In that moment, I understood something with terrible clarity. The warning had not merely gone unspoken. It had been sealed, locked behind my teeth, and no matter what followed, there would be no moment later where it could be released without sounding like regret. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They arrived in pieces, stretched over time, disguised as routine developments, small reports delivered without emphasis. There was no single moment where everything collapsed loudly enough to force recognition. Instead, there was a gradual alignment between what I had feared and what was beginning to surface. At first, it was subtle, a delay that wasn't supposed to happen, a message that arrived later than expected, a tone in someone's voice that carried a trace of strain where there had once been ease. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to as proof, just enough to create a faint, persistent unease. I noticed it immediately. That was the cruel part, because noticing no longer offered any possibility of intervention. It only sharpened awareness. Every small deviation felt like a quiet confirmation, a soft echo of the words I had never allowed to exist outside my body. I watched men adjust their expectations without acknowledging why. I watched confidence narrow into insistence. I watched explanations become shorter, more rigid, as if repeating them with greater force could restore the certainty that had begun to erode. No one spoke of mistakes. Mistakes imply choice. What I saw instead was adaptation, the kind that pretends nothing fundamental has gone wrong, that treats consequences as inconveniences rather than signals. Language shifted slightly. Optimism was maintained with effort. The machinery kept moving forward even as its rhythm began to falter. Inside me, something tightened every time a new fragment of information arrived. Not surprise. Recognition. I began to measure time differently. Each passing hour felt like distance increasing between the moment I could have spoken and the reality now unfolding. The silence I had chosen was no longer contained within me. It had extended outward, shaping events without anyone ever knowing it was there. I started to notice patterns, the very things I had sensed before, the rushed assumptions, the unexamined certainty, the dismissal of alternative considerations, were now revealing themselves through strain and loss. Not spectacularly, quietly, in ways that could be explained away individually, but not collectively. People grew tired faster. Tempers shortened. Questions were still not asked, but they hovered closer to the surface now, unspoken yet visible. I could see it in the way some men paused before speaking, as if sensing that the confidence they were expected to project no longer came naturally. And still, no one turned back. Momentum has a gravity of its own. Once enough effort has been invested in moving forward, stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. To acknowledge error would require tracing it backward, step by step, to its origin, to the moment when a different voice could have altered the path, to the silence that allowed certainty to stand unchallenged. I felt an almost unbearable tension in those days. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but a slower, heavier pressure. A knowledge settling into permanence. A growing certainty that what I had sensed was not an abstraction, not an imagined risk. It was becoming real. And I was still there, still listening, still observing, still doing exactly what was expected of me. On the surface, nothing about my behavior changed. I remained useful, reliable, invisible. Inside, the distance between who I appeared to be and what I carried widened. I would hear updates delivered in neutral tones, stripped of emotion, and feel my chest tighten as each one aligned with the shape of the warning I had never given. Sometimes I caught myself nodding automatically, then stopping, forcing my face back into stillness. Agreement had become dangerous, because now every confirmation felt like participation. There were moments when I wanted to speak, not to prevent what was happening because that was no longer possible, but simply to acknowledge it. To say, this is not surprising. To say, this is what happens when certainty replaces caution. But those words, too, had no place to go. To speak now would not be warning. It would be accusation. And accusation requires authority I did not have, and courage I no longer trusted myself to possess. So I absorbed the unfolding consequences in silence. I carried them the way one carries bad news meant for someone else, carefully, internally, without allowing it to change one's expression. But the weight accumulated. Each confirmation added mass. Each quiet realization pressed deeper into memory. There is a particular kind of helplessness that comes from recognizing your own role in events you cannot stop, not because you caused them directly, but because you removed one of the few obstacles that might have slowed them. I began to understand that silence is not neutral. It does not merely stand aside. It creates space, and that space had been filled by assumptions, by momentum, by consequences that no longer required anyone's permission to unfold. When the reality became impossible to ignore, when the cost could no longer be framed as adjustment or delay, I felt something settle inside me with a finality that left no room for denial. The worst had not happened all at once, but it had happened. And in that realization there was no shock, only a quiet, suffocating sense of arrival, as if the future I had once tried not to imagine had finally caught up. Not with the room, not with the decision-makers, but with me. With the silence I had chosen, with the words that had remained trapped, and with the knowledge that, long before the consequences became visible to everyone else, they had already been fully formed inside my own chest. I still carry that moment with me, not as a memory that fades, but as something fixed, like a scar you stop noticing until the weather changes. Time has passed. Enough that the routines of that place no longer surround me. Enough that the sounds, the smells, the constant pressure of hierarchy have loosened their grip. From the outside, it might look like distance should have softened it all. It hasn't, because what remains was never tied to location. What remains is internal. I replay that silence more often than the events that followed, not because it was louder, but because it was mine. The decisions made after were shaped by many hands. The outcomes belonged to systems, to momentum, to structures far larger than any single person. But the silence belonged only to me. I remember it in fragments now, not as a clean sequence, but as sensations, the weight in my chest, the exact tension in my jaw, the awareness of breath moving in and out while something else stayed completely still. It returns unexpectedly, in moments that have nothing to do with war or command or authority. A pause in a conversation, a question left unanswered, a hesitation that feels familiar. And suddenly I am back there, feeling the same calculation begin again, even though the stakes are smaller now, even though the room is different, even though no one is watching me with measuring eyes. The habit of silence survives its original purpose. That is something no one warns you about. At the time, I believed I was choosing restraint. I told myself it was temporary, situational, a response to a specific structure, a specific pressure. I believed that once the moment passed, once the environment changed, the silence would dissolve. Instead, it settled. It became part of how I move through decisions, part of how long I wait before speaking, part of the way I assess risk, not only external risk, but the risk of being seen. The memory does not accuse me directly. It doesn't shout. It doesn't replay itself as condemnation. It is quieter than that, more patient. It simply exists as evidence. Evidence that there was a moment when I knew something mattered, and chose not to give it form. I sometimes try to reconstruct the version of myself who spoke. I imagine what would have happened if the words had left my mouth. I don't imagine heroism. I don't imagine praise. I imagine resistance, dismissal, perhaps even failure. But in those imagined versions, there is something I no longer have: completion. Even if speaking had changed nothing, it would have ended the question. It would have closed the loop. The responsibility would have moved outward, into the room, into the structure, into the shared space of consequence. Instead, it remained internal, unresolved. I have learned that guilt does not always arrive as pain. Sometimes it arrives as permanence, as something that cannot be corrected because it was never expressed. There is no apology for silence, no confession that restores what was withheld. You cannot explain words that were never spoken without turning them into something else entirely, and so the silence stays intact, preserved in its original form. I do not think about those who suffered as often as I think about the moment before. That may sound wrong, but it is honest. Their suffering belongs to history, to records, to outcomes that can be acknowledged and named. The silence belongs to memory. It belongs to the private space where justification no longer works, where context no longer matters, where rank and structure dissolve, leaving only the question that never received an answer. Why didn't you speak? I have tried to answer it. Fear is part of the answer, but not all of it. Obedience explains something, but not enough. Self-preservation comes close, but it still feels incomplete. What I am left with is simpler and harder to accept. I stayed silent because I wanted to remain untouched. Untouched by blame, untouched by consequence, untouched by the possibility that my voice might fail. And in trying to remain untouched, I ensured that the silence would mark me more deeply than any spoken mistake ever could. There is no lesson I can offer from this, no clarity that redeems it, no meaning that transforms it into something useful. There is only the knowledge that some moments do not pass. They embed, they wait. And long after the noise fades, long after the decisions are buried under time and distance, they return, not as sound, but as pressure, as the persistent awareness of words that never entered the world, words that stayed trapped inside and never stopped being heard.